happy Monday wherever you are. Welcome to the Hockey Podcast. My name is Kevin Olenek. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_hockey. Like us on Facebook, the Hockey Podcast. And we can also subscribe on Apple and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Sean, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for asking.
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for asking. You're our kind of our, I feel like out of all of us, Devin, Chris, Tyler, Heidi, me, you're the analytic nerd. Is that fair to say that you're the analytic nerd out of all of us?
I'm very much interested in them. And as I think if anyone follows me on Twitter, they know that I'm a little, I've got some skepticism with them. I definitely think that there's a huge value to them. I just think that there's a lot of people out there that overvalue them. But I'm always willing to listen, and I'm always willing to look for new where I'm actually ill-informed, misinformed, or flat out wrong on them. So just always looking for more knowledge in terms of hockey. So that's where a lot of the new knowledge is.
Well, I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation because I think that a lot of, especially with hockey, especially with the Norris Trophy, which was one of the awards that was nominated today, it's becoming an offensive defensive award. And I think we analyze goaltenders, we analyze forwards in terms of their offensive production. But what defensive analytics is something that I feel a little new with. So this is going to be a learning lesson for me. And our guest today is a data scientist, a tactician. He does hockey analyst with the Kingston Frontenacs and is a student at Western University, but hanging out here in Vancouver. Bryce Chevallier is with us. Hello, Bryce. How are you?
Oh, very, very well. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk hockey.
I'd said, oh yeah, all of it, aren't we all? Yeah, it's been great to get back into just talking about the actual game.
Yes, yeah.
Feeling like we're getting close, so that's good. I'll ask you a little bit about the Selke forwards a little bit later, but I'm fascinated how you got into this. How did you get into doing defensive analytics? And tell us a little bit about your website. And particularly, I didn't want to mispronounce it, so pronounce it for me as well, too, please.
Right. Yeah, my website, Architect Hockey, that I just released not that long ago. I'm excited about that. But for me, hockey has always been a huge passion of mine, and especially like analytics, like the numbers side. I always memorize like every player's stats, so I was always super into that. For me, it was always just trying to learn more and more about it until I realized what you could do. And so I went to university specifically for data science so that I could like understand how to compute numbers in like big quantities and how to make sense of it all. So that was exciting for me to be able to go, and I learned a lot at university so far. I'm not done yet, but just allowing me to apply like the things I learned in data science and try to quantify hockey, because I think we can always understand more hockey. It's always evolving. I don't think any limits to it. We're definitely not there yet with like a full understanding. So I just got super passionate about that and started tweeting about it. And then I made a website, Hockey, which comes from a little bit of my French heritage as an architect. Like to say, like French word for architect, basically the same. But just the way I like look at hockey, a lot of people would be like, wow, you're like an architect, the way you visualize tactics and systems and want to quantify everything. So that's how the name came about. And I'm still adding lots of things to it, which is very exciting.
And it sounds like you have... Oh, go ahead, Sean. It sounds like you were going to say something.
Nope.
And it sounds like you're fascinated with the defensive aspect of the game. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I think the defensive aspect has always been the hardest to quantify. It's very easy to just look at points and judge how a player scores, but judging how they prevent goals has always been quite a challenge for defensive analytics. So I think that there's lots of things we can do. So obviously the main way people have been approaching this is by trying to find how many shots or goals a player prevents. But lots of problems come up with that, as in if you're looking at plus minus and taking goals against, then there's so many other factors that influence it. You can't isolate the player. It could be a bad goalie. So then people started looking at shots against. How does a player limit shots against? And then it went to Corsi, so including more shots and how much time they spend in the defensive zone. And so we actually got some really in-depth models now that can quantify defensive impacts, as the people at Evolving Hockey do and Blake McCurdy does, if you guys have seen their work probably, where they can isolate the impacts a player has on shots against, and they try to isolate it right down to the player. But the problem with that is, for me, you can't actually quantify like what the player contributed to that. There's so many factors that could be involved. So that's where I'm trying to take a look at more, like including takeaways into it, including block shots, even though block shots are not always a good metric, because the more shots you block, the more time you spend in your defensive zone, which is not always ideal. But I think what I've been looking at is incorporating forechecking stats, including block shots, puck battles, all of those kind of traditional defensive stats. And if a player can score really well in those categories while preventing shots against, I think that's a good basis for a defensive model that can incorporate everything. But it's really interesting because we can't get a full grasp on it just yet, and especially with the limited data the NHL has, which is they're adding tracking data supposed to happen in these playoffs. So we'll see if they can get more publicly available data. I'm doubting that it's going to be publicly available. But so far with what we have, I think people have actually done really good defensive models that can give a really good image of a defensive game on the player.
Yeah, what got me turned on to trying to bring you on was your lists of all the defensemen, right, breaking them down into whether they were build-up defensemen, point shot threats, defensive defensemen, and all that. Because, like I said, I've really not seen anything that's really been able to sway me in terms of the fact that I think that we do track in terms of offensively who's driving offense, yeah, and all that. And I think we're doing a really good job with that. But I think in terms of, especially in the public sphere, showing who's a good defensive player, who's just good at defending defending offense. Yeah. I believe is not quite there yet, and I don't, because I think when you end up looking at Corsi and all those type of stats, it's too much of you have too many variables, like you said, with other teammates, because you could be, the way I look at it in that aspect is like if you look at the at football and a good defensive back, they don't actually throw to them because they're doing such a good job. So I think there's times where teams do a good job at avoiding the best defensive player on the ice, and then they exploit the other ones. But I think the more, as you said, I like hearing that you're including puck battles and all that, because I think it does show a better picture.
Right. Yeah. So the way I approached making those ratings and separating different areas of play is I gathered a lot of data. Corey Schneider tracks a lot of it publicly, which is very useful. And so I combined that with all the NHL data. So I have tons of stats on how players defend the rush. Do they get targeted when attackers are coming towards them? And if they do get targeted, can they stop it? Do they still get walked around? And then combine that with how many shots they let up against, which areas they let the shots against. When I combine those stats, I have a model that combines them. So it puts similar ones together. And what I noticed is that each category is one of the groups of stats. So when I talk about rush defender that defends the rush, all the stats that come together, does he get targeted and can he prevent them? Or does he sit back and block shots to prevent shots? But what's interesting is that the public models that actually isolate shots against do correlate pretty heavily with these individual events. So that tells me that they are doing a pretty good job, even though there's certain players that you might find are a little bit better than they would say. And the other thing I find really interesting in kind of interpreting a player's game is if they do win a lot of puck battles, if they do all the traditionally good defensive plays, they get takeaways, but lots of chances against when they're on the ice. I think that kind of shows that maybe while you're watching him and you're focusing on his defensive plays, he looks really good, but there's an underlying issue there. So I think that's the hardest part to track is positioning. Like, does a player read the play well? You can't know, because if he does read the play well, then nothing's going to happen and he'll prevent the opportunity. So I think that's why you have to combine them, because if you can combine defensive actions and find really strong players in battles and one-on-one, but they still let up shots against, there's probably an underlying positioning issue where they get beat from behind. And it could also be teammates, even though we try to account for the teammates they play with. There's still lots we have to infer through stats that we can't directly look at until we have positional tracking on players.
Do you look at what about matchups? Does matchups play something like that? So, as an example, like, would you look at a Giordano and how he played against a McDavid? How would you, and would that factor into that? Do you analyze that specifically, or?
Yeah, so a lot of the micro stats, as in like puck battles and defending the rush, I don't isolate those for matchups because we just don't have enough data to be able to do that. But in terms of preventing shots against, we do try to adjust for matchups as best we can. Obviously, it's not perfect, and players with slow ice time numbers are going to have their numbers inflated if you do it in a per 60. So it's not perfect. You have to like always keep in mind the matchups when you're comparing players, because it's really hard to like track everything. And we just don't have all that information available, but we do take that into account, especially when interpreting them. Who you're defending against is very important. And I think that's probably the biggest part that is missing from just one number that you can look at and find the best defensive players in certain matchups. Yeah. Because one of the, I guess, going back to your lists and everything, the one that there was two that caught my eye as a Canucks fan. One was how high Chris Tanev was on your top end zone quarterbacks. Right. Yeah. That one. I had to double check that one too. It's not what you'd expect, but I went back. I watched lots of game tape to see if he actually does the things that it says he does. And it turns out, he's really good in the zone at supporting the offense. And I think a lot of that does have to do with playing with Quinn Hughes. I don't know if he's going to be putting up those numbers with Quinn Hughes, especially Tanev is a guy that isn't very good at getting to the zone himself. But once he's there set up, supports the Canucks' cycle game very well. As he gets lots of shot assists. He makes simple passes that are in positions for players to shoot. So he does score very highly in that category, which is very interesting. But I think that is a part of the game that he does very well, is the simple plays in the zone. And he's not going to bring you the puck there or drive play it there. But with Quinn Hughes helping him do that, he's a very good supporting player.
And then the other one that caught my eye was your list of traditional deep defensive defenders. And there's a lot of players on there that aren't very big names.
Yeah.
Zach Whitecloud and Joaquin Ryan to start, and then even going down to Derek Forbort and Oscar Vandenberg as well.
Yeah. So that's, I think, an issue with that one is the ice time is not taken into consideration. So there might be some better players, but in terms of how they perform given their role, in like the matchups they've been given and in the ice time they've been given, those players do perform actions that make them like very good defensive defensemen that sit back and prevent shots against. And Zach Whitecloud, actually, he performs extremely highly, not only in preventing shots against, but in puck battles, defending the rush. He's seems like a very complete defender, but we haven't seen that many minutes from him. So it's kind of hard to project how that's going to change. Of course, I'd love to take that into account, but this list I feel is giving a lot more of a picture on how the players are performing given their roles and situations. So you look at Oscar Fattenberg, he hasn't been given like top matchups, but when he's on the ice, he sits back and he prevents offense very well. Players don't get shots against him. He blocks, he gets in the way of shots. And he helps support like exits of the zone too is one of the criteria for that category.
So a couple of defensemen in the Vancouver and Calgary market that take a lot of heat, I'd like to kind of get your input on. For the Canucks perspective, Tyler Myers has been one that I think gets a lot of heat. Where are you at with him? What do you see in him?
So Tyler Myers is an interesting one because he is a good defenseman, but I would say he's probably a top 4 defenseman. He has good support to the offense. He can move the puck. He has a big body that's hard to pass, but he does have problems too. And the price tag on him is what is giving him a lot of the heat from the Vancouver market, because it is a hefty price tag and the Canucks are going to have some salary problems down the road probably. And I don't know if Canucks fans are going to be too forgiving of the bad contracts. And he is a useful player, so I don't know if he's a bad contract because he does help them to win. I would say he's a case of a defenseman getting overvalued because he's really big, because he's good offensively and he's big. So a lot of people would be, oh, he's good defensively, but he does get beat wide a lot on the rush. His mobility is probably an issue. We've been seeing young defensemen get a lot smaller because they're very mobile. If they do get beat, they can catch up and close the gap very fast, which a lot of big defensemen are not able to do that. And the ones that are, like Colton Parayko, for example, are super successful. So I think Tyler Myers is probably not the top guy that he should be on the money he is at, or on the top line. Even like a second defenseman, I think he's probably a 3 or 4 guy.
Fair. And from the Flames, TJ Brody has not so much lately, but he's been a guy that has been on the sort of on the firing line for Flames fans. What do you see with him?
I actually love TJ Brody's game. He doesn't do things that are going to he's very good at blocking shots. He plays deep, and he has great passing. So it's probably one of the most underrated parts of a defenseman's game is their build-up play. It's one of the categories I have. So sitting back, stretch passes, kind of up the offense from the back. I think TJ Brody does a phenomenal job at that. But his offensive contribution is very low. He doesn't shoot a lot. So when you're looking at highlights, I can see why people would undervalue him. He also isn't great against the rush. So he's not a perfect, he has lots of flaws, but he's very good at passing. He sits back. He's a good base, especially playing with a guy like Giordano, who can support the offense and cover a lot of his areas. He is pretty useful. And I think against a team like Winnipeg, TJ Brody could really be beneficial because Winnipeg do not forecheck hard. They don't have a good defense at all. So having a guy like Brody who can split passes right through them and create quick counterattacks the other way is really useful. But again, not a perfect player for sure, and definitely has his limitations.
It's interesting that I just wanted to note that you said that you don't feel that Winnipeg's good defensively. Why do you feel that? What is your basis for that?
Well, Winnipeg, their defense group is very thin. Since they lost Trouba, they lost Myers, they lost Buffalian. They have been left with Neil Pionk as probably their only good defenseman. Morrissey's okay. So it's very in blue line that's honestly does not cover well at all, and they do not make up for it with their forward defending at all either. Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, Patrick Laine, all great going forward. They do not really add any defensive value. So when you combine lack of forechecking, lack of defensive coverage, and then just a weak blue line, I think Winnipeg is a team that does not play good defense, and it's shown in their numbers. The one problem is, of course, Connor Hellebuck in the back is a brick wall, and so very hard to beat. And why he's probably going to win the Vezina this year is he's been performing with very good numbers, just almost no support from anyone on that team.
Just to continue on with that, last year when the Flames played the Avalanche, I felt that their defense was not good against the speed that the Avalanche played with. The Jets have the ability to play a very good north-south speed style. The one pairing that really got lit up last year was the Hominick and Hanifin pairing. The Flames aren't going to have Hominick this season, this playoffs, but is that really where the Jets are going to have to exploit the Flames to be successful in that series?
I think that's exactly it. I think Peg is kind of like the Avalanche in how they attack, and the Flames are not built to defend that. If I look at the defensemen that can defend the rush for Calgary, there really isn't anybody. Derek Forbert is above average, but he's not relied on for like big minutes. Other than that, Mark Giordano is just below average at defending the rush, and he's the best one on the blue line. So I think that is a problem for Calgary. They really struggled against Colorado. And Winnipeg will definitely be looking to attack very quick. Winnipeg do not really pass around in the offensive zone. They just go directly for it. They take the puck and they drive the net and score goals, and Calgary's not built to defend that. So likely will be a problem for the Flames. They're better bet than Colorado, though, because of the way Colorado is kind of built defensively. They do have a stable base to attack off of, whereas Winnipeg don't at all. They just attack and do not. They just rely on Hellebuck to save them. So it's a little bit of a different matchup in that sense, but I think that is definitely a major weakness for Calgary that Winnipeg will be licking their lips on.
So, for the Wild, just to switch that over to that for a second, for the Canucks Wild series, in terms of the Wild defenses, what are you specifically seeing? There's the Ryan Suter, Matt Dumba. It seems like they have good depth. What are you seeing? Where are the Canucks going to struggle, and where are the Canucks going to exploit some weaknesses from your perspective?
I think the Wild actually have one of the better built defensive groups. They play very well together. And when we talk about team defense, the way they prevent shots together as a unit is very strong. I would have given a lot of credit to Bruce Boudreau for that, which is no longer the coach. They fired him. So I don't know if they've been having a lot of time with the new coach. So sure if their players are just very good and playing the Boudreau way. But they have a very deep defensive group, and guys like Jared Spurgeon is oftentimes like one of the analytics' favorite defensemen. He is very good at driving play. Jonas Brodin is extremely good in the neutral zone, defending the rush and also rushing the other way. Matt Dumba is a great shooter who can also play defense, and Ryan Suter obviously takes big minutes and can support the offense. So they have lots of options, and I think it's definitely better than the Canucks' blue line. I think the Wild are going to probably control play. Their problem, though, is Devin Dubnyk is not good at all, and the goaltending has just been a problem for for Minnesota. So the Canucks have some sharpshooters. I think they're built to beat the goalies, but in terms of a defensive group that's going to kind of push play in Vancouver's end, Minnesota definitely have that group that'll help them do that.
And then with the Wild forwards in offense versus the Canucks defense, what do you see from that matchup as well?
Yeah, so I think the Wild offense, obviously there's a lack of star power. They don't have guys that are going to score lots of goals. Kevin Fiala's kind of been breaking through this year. I'm not sure if he's really a top scorer, though. I think the Canucks play very well on the cycle, but their defense is they don't prevent the rush very well at all. So I think teams can just exploit the Canucks very easily if they are built to go in the rush. Thankfully for the Canucks, the Wild are not really that team. They play dump and chase. Actually, both the Canucks and the Wild dump and chase a lot to the teams that play the most dump and chase in the league. So the Wild offense isn't really built to expose the Canucks' defense, but they have good options. They have strong forecheckers, and I think their defense will help them drive play into the offensive zone. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the series is spent in the Canucks' zone, even though the Canucks do play well on the cycle. I just don't think the Wild have the speed to expose the Canucks' biggest weaknesses. And so I'm not sure if that's the best matchup for Minnesota.
I know that on your, I'm sure you're going through this. You broke down the Blackhawks and the Oilers, and you've broken down the Rangers Hurricane series. And kind of what are you seeing there, especially with the Hawks and the Oilers, who have four well-known forwards for almost larger-than-life forwards. What are you seeing there?
Yeah. Well, I think those four forwards are going to have huge impacts on the series. The teams they're built around those guys. They're two not very deep teams, so I think that's going to be a very fast-paced series. Even though the Oilers do like to try to limit play when McDavid and Draisaitl aren't on the ice, they like to kind of calm things down and keep it kind of quiet until McDavid and Draisaitl come on. But Chicago is extremely high tempo. I think they play the worst defense in the league. They're kind of like Winnipeg, but more extreme, where there's no defense and it's all transitional attack. So it'll be a lot of counterattacking against Edmonton. And when you combine that with Draisaitl and McDavid, it's going to be very fast paced, probably lots of goals. The defense isn't built to defend against those superstars either. So it'll probably be fun to see them go to work and skate through the teams, score lots of goals probably, but it'll be a fast-paced series for sure. And I think the Blackhawks are going to be heavily reliant on Corey Crawford to try to save them. And I heard, last I heard, he was unfit to play. So it'll be interesting to see if he's back in time for the series or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
One part we didn't actually get to. Sorry for jumping around to all these different series, but the Flames offense versus as you said, the bad Jets defense. Just comparing those two and what the Flames need to do to exploit the Jets defense.
Yeah. So I think for the Flames, it's definitely they're going to have to try to put pressure on the Jets defense because they're just not very strong. And so I think strong forecheck will be very beneficial for the Flames. They have guys that are very good forecheckers, Matthew Tkachuk, even Milan Lucic and Dylan Dubé have been great on the forecheck. For the Flames, they're going to have to try to forecheck hard and prevent the Jets from transitioning the other way. Their main problem, though, is, of course, if you commit too many players onto the forecheck, then you have less players sitting back, which leaves them a lot more open for the counterattack the other way. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach that because they're going to have to put lots of pressure on the weak defense, and they're going to have to get lots of shots on Hellebuck because he's a great goalie, and beating him will be very important. But they've also got to manage going the other way that Winnipeg is just going to counterattack in an instant, and guys like Laine, guys like Connor, guys like Scheifele can score out. Like, their shots are just better than average. So it's going to be interesting. I think this matchup, like Winnipeg, is probably one of the harder ones to predict. I think they're very even teams that play two different ways. they're both kind of built to exploit the other team, in that Winnipeg can attack in the transition and Calgary can't defend that, and Calgary forechecks and Winnipeg can't defend that, but it also leaves them weak against in the other way. So it'll be interesting to see which team can kind of manage the risk and reward of playing their style while not giving the other team what they want.
Do you have any insight about where you would put Lindholm? Is Lindholm more effective with the Jets in your mind playing with Monahan or Gaudreau, or would you put him at center?
I have to take more look into that. Lindholm he's pretty good. I don't know if he's standout. I don't know if they should waiver from Monahan at center. Although Monahan isn't the ideal first set, number one center, but it's an interesting question. I think Monahan is probably a little bit of a better version than Lindholm, and I would probably stick with Monahan at center on the top line.
Okay. That's one of the big debates in Calgary, where you play Lindholm. So
yeah, well, I think he does fulfill a lot of the same role that Monahan does, a bit better defensively. But Monahan I think he's a better shooter, and Gaudreau as a playmaker, I think they need to use that pairing. But Gaudreau is going to have to drive the offense for this line because Gaudreau is a great player. And I know there's lots of debate. Last year, he didn't really show up against the Avalanche, and McKinnon kind of took over. So I think, again, Gaudreau will have an important role, and it's easy to blame him when it goes wrong, but he really does need to show up, especially against Winnipeg, because he does drive the offense. He's the main playmaker, main puck carrier. So I think Gaudreau is going to have an important role in that, and I think either Monahan or Lindholm could fit with him, but it'll be up to Gaudreau.
Fair.
To show up.
Did you have other questions about the series before we jump into something else?
The only one I want to kind of just a little check in with Bryce on is the Zach McEwen and Jake Virtanen debate that's going on in Vancouver now. What are your stats showing on in terms of that?
So I don't have a huge sample of stats on Zach McEwen, but he does perform very well in his small sample. He drives offense extremely well, and he's a good all-around player, definitely. I think he's NHL level. I think he does deserve to be in the lineup, but I think Virtanen's also pretty underrated. He's not I saw debates on Canucks Twitter comparing him to Cam Neely earlier. He's not that good, but he's a solid third line guy, and he's actually one of the best skaters on the Canucks. So the Canucks don't really have lots of good transitional skaters. Virtanen is one of them. He's very one-dimensional. I think he needs to work on his kind of creativity, decision-making, but he drives the net and he creates lots of offense. So he's a very useful player, especially for, I would say, Vancouver's third line to get some offense going. Zach McEwen, I'd have to see more of him, but for what I've seen, he's been very good. And I think he is an NHL level player. So I don't know if you put him on the fourth line. I wouldn't take Virtanen out for McEwen. But maybe there's some players I don't know, Jay Beagle, and I don't see much value in Jay Beagle, to be honest. So it's interesting. I'd have to see more of McEwen, but I think he has been very good this time.
What about Louis Eriksson? And you know, some people may be like, "This is ridiculous for me to ask the question," but it's very clear that Travis Green values his defensive output.
Yeah, I mean, he's my model does have him pretty good defensively in terms of guy that covers deep, but it's just not great. Especially for the money, it's hard to disconnect him from his contracts. If you completely forget about his contract, sure, he's an NHL player, that can play deep, but I think he's just not very good. I think Travis Green has to defend him because of the contract. You can't just get rid of him. Brandon Sutter probably fulfills his role better. And there's the perception on Louis Eriksson is that he's a scorer, right? He's not supposed to be like the defensive specialist like Brandon Sutter is. But that's really what his game has come to. He's really like all the scoring is basically washed up. He doesn't carry the puck very well. It's not like he's getting unlucky. There's just no chances created from Eriksson. So I don't know if there is enough value defensively to justify having him in the lineup, but he's, again, probably a fourth liner. A guy that probably Brandon Sutter fills his role better. I would like to see Zach McEwen play. But yeah, it's hard to separate him from his contract. Of course, the highest paid player on the Canucks. So,
yeah, fair. And just quickly for me, back to the Flames. I'd like to do a little bit of comparison with Backlund and Derek Ryan. First of all, I guess how much of a loss if Derek Ryan cannot go? How much of a loss is that? And defensively, who is actually more effective? Is it Backlund or is it Derek Ryan?
So my model has Derek Ryan as the better defensive player. Backlund is a very good sitting back defensively. So Backlund scores very highly in my build-up category. So he sits back and kind of sets up the attack from deep, which kind of gives the perception that he's in the defensive zone a lot and a good defensive player. But he really, my model has him as basically average defensively. Derek Ryan is a very good defensive player, actually. Doesn't really forecheck hard, but he's also a great skater. So, but from the stats I have, Derek Ryan does look like the better player. They both kind of help the transition. Derek Ryan's a better skater and Backlund's a better passer, but Ryan definitely looks better defensively.
It's interesting. Okay. Sean, did you have anything?
No, I think we can move on from jumping around from all the playoff series into. I completely didn't pay attention to the schedule of awards, but having Bryce on for the day that they announced the Selke and the Norris, I think is actually makes us look good.
That's well timed. Well timed. Yeah, that was. I wanted to get into that. So yeah, let's go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, let's start with the Norris because I think that's a little more. I think it was pretty straightforward that they definitely got the top three there.
Yeah, I think so too. If I had a ballot, I probably would have put Pietrangelo ahead of Hedman, but I think those top three are pretty accurate. I know a lot of people in the analytics community do have a problem with it, especially because they are just the top three defensemen in points. If you look at points, it's Carlson, then Yossi, then Hedman. So I don't think it's that big of a problem, though, because I probably would have voted for the same players. I know John Carlson, his season was pretty insane going forward. The point totals were crazy, so I think he has to be there. He does have some defensive problems. And so a lot of people in the analytics community wouldn't have voted for him. They would have rather have a guy like Jacob Slavin or Alex Pietrangelo in this place. But these are just three very well-rounded defenders. I think I would probably pick Yossi to win. Yossi plays a very unique game. He's not really a traditional defenseman. He's very good at skating, very good at passing, and does he really drives play more than a normal defenseman does. And so a lot of people would still pick Carlson over him because he had more points. I tend to think about how many of Carlson's points came from just beating the puck to Ovechkin, especially on the power play. But he's a great player all around. Even defensively, I think Carlson is underrated by some of the analytics models. They have him as a very poor defensive player, but actually defending the rush and using his stick, he's very strong at that. So I think he is a really good pick. And if I were to change one, it'd be Victor Hedman, because I think Hedman is another guy who gets overvalued defensively because of his big body, but he's still very good at it. So it's hard to complain.
And what about from you've been tweeting a little bit this morning about the Selke. So tell us where you're at with that.
Yeah, well, the Selke is one of the most interesting, probably controversial awards because traditionally it goes to like the top center that takes hard matchups and still performs really well in them. So a guy who can put points up in tough matchups. But there's kind of been a huge debate on the analytics community on what the Selke should be given to, because there's players that play specialty defensive roles that are relatively no-name players compared to Bergeron, Couturier, O'Reilly, but that really shut down play. They're only used on defense, so they're not two-way players. So it's kind of hard. Do you pick the best two-way player? Do you pick the best defensive specialist only? Because there are guys, especially like Valerie Nichushkin, Blake Coleman, and Oliver Bjorkstrand even, who are very good defensively. And even guys like Zach Aston Reese, who is just a defensive shutdown player that doesn't offer much else. But he's probably one of the best defensive forwards in the league if you just look at defense. But I think for me, it's really hard to take into account the matchup, so you kind of have to give it to one of the top guys. So I don't think the picks are too controversial, actually. I think Bergeron is probably he's been, like a lot of people would say, oh, he's only there for his reputation, but he still does very well in defensive actions. Like, he's just a good defensive, like, reliable player to have. And I don't know if I would have picked Bergeron this year, but I can see why he's there. And then O'Reilly and Couturier, of course, they take huge matchups, and they are very good defensive players. So I don't think there's too much of a complaint there. Although I do love guys like Anthony Cirelli and Philip Deneau, who I think are probably never going to get nominated, but I think they do have lots of defensive value in those guys.
So if you had to, like, if it's 2022 and you needed one of these three defensive players on your Canadian Olympic team, which one would you take?
I would probably take Sean Couturier. I think Sean Couturier I think he's the youngest out of all of them, first of all. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think so. And he's just so complete, and his game is not only defensive, but he's also very, very strong defensively. And it's not only just sitting back and playing defense, it's also forechecking, so like proactive defense. He defends from in his own end and then also in the offensive zone by forechecking. And he's so good in puck battles. If you put him up against anyone in the world, he's probably going to win the puck battle. And he drives play very well. So I think Sean Couturier definitely deserves. I would probably take him. So this kind of goes back to the debate on the Selke, because I don't know if he's specifically the best defensive player, but if I want a player on my team to shut down the other opposition, I'm taking Sean Couturier.
Fair. Okay. Last one for me. I'm kind of curious what to expect from a defensive perspective as we get into these qualifiers and sort of the round robin play. I mean, I think everyone is agreeing that it's going to be intense, but the play is going to be sloppy. How are we going to look at this defensively? How quick do you think that the structure will get into place? Kind of from your perspective, what are you sort of expecting? And my unscientific theory is probably whoever can get that game structured in place has probably one of the better chances to win not only the series but probably the Stanley Cup.
Yeah, that's probably one of the things I'm most interested in watching unfold, because especially come playoff time, structure matters a lot. Like, the intensity goes up a lot. So if you actually watch for the details and watch for the tactics and where players are getting value from in the playoffs, everything is brought out a lot more. Like, player skills, matchups are brought up significantly more, especially as you go deeper into the playoffs. So like last year, especially in the finals, St. Louis, Boston, it was like very tight. There was very little room to make mistakes. So it'll be interesting, because I think I am expecting the intensity to be very high, because of course the stakes are still the same. They're still just as high. And it'll be interesting to see whether the tactics, like the structure's there, whether the bounces are there. Maybe players are going to be making mistakes because in playoff time with such high intensity, every mistake is brought out a lot more. So I don't know, like players are probably going to have that as well, but with more mistakes. So I think it'll be very important to come out of the gate ready because the intensity is going to be high. Mistakes are probably going to be high, and mistakes are just brought out a lot more. So it's going to be, I do think the team that can kind of find their structure and minimize the spaces to make mistakes or have like a system to prevent mistakes from happening or recover them when there is a mistake is going to be extremely important and probably help a team win the cup. Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the keys. I think it's always been a key to win the Stanley Cup. This year, probably more. It'll be interesting to see if teams get less sloppy as we get deeper in, but especially for the qualifying rounds. It's probably going to be some sloppy play, but intense play. It'll be fun to watch.
And I also think the fascination here too is with the round robin because they almost have the advantage in some ways of getting that structure in place. Although I'm not sure you want to go 0-1. I do think you want to get off to a quick start there. You want to get that first win and kind of take advantage of that. But
yeah, I think the first game will matter, especially like even just past like the mental side of getting the first win is the best of 5 now, so you only have to win 3 games. And so immediately like the pressure is put on when you lose a game. Every game is like more pressure put on than normal. But coming out of the gate, I'm not too sure if I believe that getting out of the gate strong is like extremely important. What we've seen from a lot of championship teams in the past is that they actually come out of the gate slowly. I've noticed this in like a lot of tournaments. St. Louis last year did win their first 2 games, but in the past, I've noticed that a lot of championship teams across multiple sports kind of get out of the gate a little bit slowly, but adjust very fast. You can't let it go on. And that's going to be probably important this year to not, because you don't have as much room for error. You only have 3 games to lose. And as soon as you're down 2 games, like if you lose 2 games, then the pressure is very much on. And that's probably not an ideal spot to be in.
For sure. Sean, did you have any other questions or?
No, I think we covered a lot here today.
All right. Well, Bryce, thank you for that. So tell us how to follow you again and kind of tell us what you've got coming up and what to look for on your website.
Right. So I've got my Twitter account. My name's just Bryce Chevallier, but the @ is @Faucentre. And my website, Architect Hockey, I'm working on adding a lot of things to that. I've got all my categories and like styles up on the website for Patreons, and I've also got the charts that are completely interactive. Right now I'm working on player profiles so that you get a full view of a player in one picture and heat maps on the rink to see where they perform their actions. I'm also implementing those. So those will probably be up on the website within the next few weeks. I'm very excited for that. And then, yeah, I'll be posting lots of articles on Architect Hockey and tweeting lots as the playoffs happen and we go through the summer.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on with us. We really appreciate it. I think it's very valuable. It's an interesting thing to look at defensive dynamics as well. So we really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. And you can, of course, follow us, podcast_hockey, Facebook, The Hockey Podcast, subscribe on Apple and Spotify. Stay tuned for other podcasts. We've got Chris Faber coming. We're going to be talking about with the Winnipeg Jets podcast and a Minnesota Wild podcast as well this week. So keep an eye out for that. Sean, thank you, and we will talk to you all soon. Bye for now.